Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on some questions that have been asked about tough decisions that we have to make when our short-term security interests or those of our partners conflict with longer-term strategic interests or even just the standing of the United States in a given part of the world. The example of Egypt was used earlier, where there is a prohibition on the kind of military assistance we've given that regime, the current regime, if it is a regime that's in place due to a coup. And we have essentially looked the other way because of very real short-term immediate problems. ISIS, I think, was one of the reasons given for contravening that part of U.S. law or policy. To move back to this hemisphere, you can use the example of Guatemala in the 50s or Chile in the 1970s, El Salvador, Nicaragua in the 1980s, to see where that short-term focus has caused us long-term problems and probably more importantly caused the people in those countries significant suffering and long-term harm. Tell me, and I'll start with General Fraser, your thoughts on the administration's recent decision to withhold 15% of Mérida funding to Mexico because of human rights concerns. I know that's not strictly military aid, but it's connected to military aid that we've given that country. Is that a step in the right direction to begin to hold regimes accountable for things like human rights and their conduct using the money that U.S. taxpayers have supplied?
Congressman, thank you for that question. I think that, and there's been a big focus, at least in my time in Southern Command. I know General Kelly continues it and has actually expanded the program on the focus on human rights and the importance of militaries sustaining their focus on human rights. But as you say, there are very hard decisions that have to be made as we go through and look at what the results are. So I will argue that we need to have a very clear focus there as well and determine what we're trying to achieve and measure how we are able to do that. It's a situation that will always be troublesome as we go through, and I don't know all the specifics around the specifics of the Mérida, but I know that there's a lot of focus and effort that the armed forces put in to vetting organizations with whom they work for, with abiding by human rights vetting, and then supporting those organizations that we should. And in fact, the example I'll use is during my time in Southern Command, we had a problem where one of the countries decided to shoot down airplanes, and we had to stop aid going into them very specifically for that reason. But on the other side of that, the current militaries, I have a hard time if they have not had any human rights violations in 20 years, that we hold them accountable for what happened 20 years ago. There's somewhere in there has to be a balance.
Yeah, and I don't know if other members of the panel would like to address this issue of how we balance what we stand for to ourselves and much of the rest of the world. Democracy and freedom and human rights with some of the regimes and non-regime actors that we support who don't help us to achieve those things for the people in those countries. And does that diminish our standing in those regions, in those countries, and is it counterproductive ultimately?
It's definitely an issue, because as you've highlighted, we often have conflicting objectives. We have a short-term objective that's about improving the security situation or improving the capability of partner forces. But we have long-term objectives that have to do with our national values, things about human rights, things about democracy and other kinds of issues. So I think we have to recognize that sometimes these objectives are in conflict and there has to be some prioritization. From some of the cases I've examined over 20-year periods, we find that, yes, if there's a suspension of the relationship due to human rights violations, that does unsurprisingly impair our ability to build partner capacity, but pleasantly, in most of those cases, it's also caused the partner to improve their behavior.
Yeah.
No, and maybe to add, I share your concern because while we might not have a deep appreciation for history, our partners certainly do. And we have to be very careful in protecting, what the United States holds dear. And because we have a very non-exclusive list of partners, I really think what we need to make sure is that when we inculcate with these programs, that we're doing it in accordance with American values. And I think the officers that at least I teach understand that, and I think programs like Leahy Vetting ensure that we identify that. But there are long-term consequences because our history shows we will support a wrong side. A U.S. graduate of an IMET program will stage a coup. That happens, as you know, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.